Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour. My name is Louis-Carl Brissette, and I'm with the communication team at Public Safety Canada. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. Je m'appelle Louis-Carl Brissette et je suis membre de l'équipe des communications de Sécurité publique Canada. C'est un plaisir d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. Today, Honorable Harjit Sajjan, President of the King's Privy Council of Canada and Minister for Emergency Preparedness and Minister responsible for the Pacific Economic Development Agency of Canada, and the Honorable Lisa Naylor, Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure for Manitoba, are pleased to hold a press conference following the federal-provincial territories meeting of ministers responsible for emergency management. Aujourd'hui, l'honorable Harjit Sajjan, président du Conseil privé pour le roi du Canada et ministre de la Protection civile et ministre responsable de l'Agence de développement économique du Pacifique Canada, et l'honorable Lisa Naylor, ministre des Transports et de l'Infrastructure du Manitoba, sont heureux de tenir une conférence de presse suivant la réunion des ministres fédéraux, provinciaux, territoriaux responsables de la sécurité civile. To give you an idea of how today's event will unfold, we will hear a brief remarks from Minister Sajjan and Naylor followed by a question and answer session. Pour vous donner un aperçu du déroulement d'aujourd'hui, les ministres Sajjan et Naylor prendront la parole. Ensuite, nous aurons une période de questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today on the unceded and traditional territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. For the last 2 days, I've been meeting with my provincial and territorial colleagues as well as Indigenous leaders to talk about emergency preparedness in our country. And this morning, we were provided with an alarming but not surprising update on the upcoming wildfire season. We were warned that we need to be prepared for the worst. So make no mistake, we are facing the most pressing challenge of our time. Climate change is real and it's here. We cannot wish climate change away. The costs are just too great. And that is why we gathered here for the last 2 days. These meetings were an opportunity for us to share lessons that we have learned in the last year and the years in the past. Early reporting suggests that this year's wildfire season could be worse than the last. Now, even though it may be worse, our collective goal is to limit the impact on Canadians. And last year we saw 18.5 million hectares of our country burn. And just to put that into perspective, that's 3 times the size of Nova Scotia. We are here today because we know that we cannot face these challenges alone. In 2023 was the worst fire season in our Canadian history. Over 230,000 people were forced to flee from their homes. 124 First Nations were impacted by wildfires, with 93 evacuations occurring in 82 of those communities, and sometimes twice. Before 2020, the Government Operations Center would coordinate between about 5 to 12 requests for assistance per year. From January 2020 to August 2023, we have responded to more than 230. We are seeing increased climate-related disasters across our country. From the Atlantic, where just this month, a generational snowstorm in Nova Scotia cut off communities from the rest of the province, to the prairies, where extreme droughts are making life harder for farmers and creating conditions for a devastating wildfire season, and to the north, where the past summer we saw entire communities being evacuated, and to my home province of British Columbia, where there is now no time in between floods and fires. And I'm grateful to be here with my co-host and friend, Lisa Naylor, who is the Manitoba Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure, and also with the rest of my ministerial colleagues who came across the country. Today, we are building on our plans that will help us advance the federal, provincial, territorial emergency management strategy. It is important to step forward in our collective efforts on emergency management in Canada. Together, we are seeking ways to expand access to emergency measures capabilities that we know are needed and that are needed critically. Now, this includes work to improve our communications with Canadians in emergencies and to work together to explore innovative ways to improve our interoperability, from strengthening the sustainability and governance of the National Public Alerting System to the upcoming launch of the public engagement on a national PSBN and the ongoing work to implement an earthquake early warning system that will be launched this year. We also convened to discuss efforts to advance the collection of flood data and to stand up a low-cost flood insurance program. and we discussed efforts to help Canadians build back better through a modernized disaster financial assistance arrangement to get the support for Canadians and to get the support there faster for them. Additionally, we looked at ways to build our civilian response capacity. And let me be clear, our top priority is to protect lives and the Canadian livelihood. And that is why we are collaborating actively with the national Indigenous organizations, provinces, and territories to achieve this shared goal and to meet the immediate challenges of the next season. And today is an example of that collaboration. And yesterday, in a dedicated meeting, we met with the leaders of the national Indigenous organizations. And I want to thank the Regional Chief Antoine of the Assembly of the First Nations, also President Kiron of the Métis National Council, and President Obed, who's with the President of the ITK, for some really important discussions. Together, we shared their emergency management priorities that support the resilience of Indigenous communities and greater emergency response and recovery. As climate-related disasters increase, so does the risk and impact on Indigenous communities across the country. So I look forward to strengthening our collaboration to address the priorities that we discussed in the last few days. What I've seen so far as I travel the country, that we have a common thread within our communities. Mayors, local provincial counterparts who are on the front lines of this crisis, who while responding to the fires closest to them are at the same time preparing for communities right next to them. Community members who are worried about the safety of their families and the homes that they have built for themselves after a lifetime of hard work. First responders who have put themselves in harm's way to protect their communities all share a deep concern as Canada continues to face the unprecedented impact of climate change. But amidst all this, Canadians have shown time and time again how much more resilient that we are when we work together. So I look forward to continuing this work with all our partners here today, and I'm confident that we are making progress for Canadians in making our life safer. We will continue to work together to help Canadians face this emerging challenge of climate change, but I want to just take this opportunity to thank all my provincial, territorial, and Indigenous leaders, counterparts who have made this last 2 days very fruitful. Thank you so much. And now I'll take the opportunity to have Minister Naylor say a few words.
Excuse me. Thank you, everyone. Just to speak on behalf of the provincial and territorial members at these meetings, the Emergency Measures FPT meeting was very productive and informative. Day one consisted of a joint meeting between National Indigenous leadership and the FPT membership. Lessons learned from last year's hazard season were shared among us, and a commitment was made to improve coordination between governments. And day two was an engaging discussion between FPT ministers on our shared priorities. We all feel a sense of urgency to protect and support Canadians in the face of emergencies worsened by climate change. But I also feel confident that we are laying the groundwork to do this well, to do this better. Throughout the meeting, there has been discussion around wildfires and disaster preparedness in general, flood insurance, the disaster financial assistance arrangements modernization, and a pan-Canadian civilian response model, among other topics. There is a clear desire to collaborate between governments, and so it was a very productive meeting, leaving us feeling confident and hopeful as we take our next steps towards protecting Canada.
Thank you, Minister Naylor. We'll now begin our portion for Q&A. I will now open the floor to media. My name is Joanna Kanga. I'm the Press Secretary and Outreach Advisor to Minister Sajjan. Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue à notre conférence de presse. On va maintenant commencer avec les questions pour les médias. Mon nom est Joanna Kanga. Je suis l'attachée de presse et conseillère au rayonnement pour le ministre Sajjan. Ce sera une question, un follow-up. It will be one question, one follow-up. We'll start with the floor and then we'll move online. Please state your name and outlet. Vous pouvez commencer avec votre nom et votre média et commencer avec votre question. Merci.
Hi, Ministers. Davis Legree, iPolitics. Mr. Sajjan, late last year you told the Canadian press that you anticipated running some pilot projects this year for a national emergency response agency. Can you give us an update as to how that work is progressing?
Yes, we had some discussions today on the progress of this. The whole purpose of this is to increase the support for the provinces. As you know, that the provinces and territories are responsible for the management of emergencies, and the federal government's ability is to provide support. And the Canadian Armed Forces has done amazing work and been called upon, but we want to make sure that we have the right resource at the right place at the right time. And that's what this pilot project is about increasing the level of support within the province to provide everything from a greater wildfire response, also for flooding. In addition to this is to making sure that there is support for Canadians when they're also being evacuated as well. That's where the humanitarian workforce concept comes in, where we support organizations like SARVAC, Red Cross, St. John Ambulance, and others who can provide greater support. So the work is ongoing, but we'll have more to say as the pilot project continues.
And just as a follow-up, earlier this month, activists burned a stroller on Parliament Hill and spray-painted the PMO as part of a call for a national firefighting agency. I'm just wondering what you would say to those people and for other protesters planning similar stunts in the future.
Well, I was a little confused by the actions, but having the work that needs to be done. As I've stated from the beginning, we've been open to all options when it comes to providing greater support for the provinces. But one thing is for sure, we need to make sure it's actually the right support. There are great ideas out there, and we're listening to all of them. And we had some number of discussions of what potentially can work. But one thing I've also said is, anything that we try, we're going to stress test it. Because the last thing you want is create something and it doesn't suit the needs of the emergency that we're trying to deal with. I will be looking at models in other countries as well. I've already had the opportunity to deal with international disasters, but we are looking at models like, for example, Germany does have a civilian response force model, and what I want to do is making sure that any response that we have, that we're able to respond very quickly, and it's built at the local level. And anybody who has any experience on emergency response, when there's an emergency, the resources that are on the ground are the ones that are impactful the most. So what we want to do is work directly with the municipalities of increasing their capability so that they can respond. And that's then when the province comes in for that immediate response right afterwards, and the federal government also then steps in. To do this well, we need good situational awareness across the country. So that's where the emergency operations centers come in, working at the provincial level, and our government operations center plays a very important role. So when you have good situational awareness, you know exactly what is going on. So if something happened at a municipal level, for example, even within the snowstorms, we already knew what type of resources potentially might be needed. And so with that level of knowledge, we're getting resources ready. So we're essentially what we try to do is rack and stack the resources. So as one is running out, the other one's already on its way. So there is no gap in place. And that's what we were talking about today, to making sure that we're ready for the next season.
Hi there, Ministers. Marina von Stackelberg with CBC National News. Thanks for taking our questions. My first question is the guidelines for how Ottawa provides financial relief to provinces and territories in disasters. They are about to expire in just a little over a year. So I'm curious as to what you will be changing about those guidelines and if it will include more money for provinces and territories. And for Minister Naylor, is there something that the provinces and territories would like to see changed in these guidelines?
So I'm assuming you're talking about the disaster financial assistance arrangement. So it's not that it's expiring. We actually want to modernize it. This program was developed in the 1970s, and as you can see, it wasn't designed for the significant climate change realities that we're dealing with today. So we want to modernize it, and we've speaking with our provincial territorial counterparts and our Indigenous leaders. But we've also been talking with a lot of mayors. So every time I've gone after a disaster, go visit and talk with the leadership, one thing that we heard, the current disaster financial assistance arrangement, right now, you can only build back based on what has been destroyed. And sometimes the municipality has ideas on how they can prevent the disaster. So rather than actually building back the same way, what we want to do is build back better. So that's one of the things that we're looking at the disaster financial assistance arrangement. How do we can be streamline the response as well? So that's also being worked on. There's going to be far more focus on prevention than building back in the same way. We're also looking at making sure that we have the right data for the provinces and the municipalities. For example, there's a flood mapping portal with the appropriate data, so municipalities can make the appropriate decisions on zoning as well. So this is coupled with the reforms of the DFAA is one thing, but also coupled with all the appropriate data is going to be very important so they can make the appropriate decisions and making sure that they have the appropriate response.
Thank you, and I'll just add to that, that certainly the provinces and territories are interested in the Build Back Better model. Manitoba's built on a floodplain, so when a road is washed out and we build it back to how it was before, it's probably going to get washed out again. So this will be an opportunity to build the road better in the future. We also want to see more investments in mitigation coming out of this program.
Thanks for that. My follow-up question is, you mentioned that it was very fruitful conversations you had specifically to do with coordinating better. So I want to know specifically out of these meetings what you've come up with to coordinate better in the next disaster or natural disaster, next wildfire that we see.
Absolutely. This is where the Emergency Operations and the Government Operations Center takes place. To coordinate better, you also need to make sure you have the appropriate relationships and rehearse and practice. So the exercises that have been conducted in the past and the ones that we'll conduct in the future will allow us to test our systems. And so that will also look at making the improvements. Plus making sure that we have the right resources as well when it comes to the CIFC, which is the interagency for movement of firefighters across our country, and also for international as well. But as we talk about wildfires, we need to also make sure that we're ready for other disasters. Flooding is one of them, but we also talked about other disasters because we went from floods, wildfires, hurricanes, to snowstorms. So those are those things that we're looking at. Plus, we're even looking at those other, hopefully less likely scenarios, but nonetheless, we need to get ready for them. For example, earthquakes. So we had a briefing on the earthquake early warning system. What are the things that we need to do? And how to look at standardizing emergency operation centers. And I spoke with my provincial counterparts and how we can go, each province can go visit different ones to see what works for them. But more importantly, each one needs to be built on its own provincial and territorial uniqueness, because what type of resources are needed in the Atlantic provinces is going to be very different from the provinces. So being built standardizing, but having that unique capability to respond is going to be very important. And I would say the best response is when you have people who are the right decision makers already know one another, building those relationships, know each other's capabilities, that's what gets you the fastest response.
Is Minister Naylor also able to answer my question too?
Sorry, can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, so you were mentioning that you're working on improving coordination. That was a big topic of discussion, and I wanted to know specifically out of these meetings what sort of new coordination you've come up with or what sort of new plan you have.
I think that some of that plan will be coming forward when the new DFAA is announced. But for me, the experience of these 2 days was the collaboration, the opportunity to have these discussions, particularly yesterday, spending an entire day with Indigenous leaders from across the country, and having that opportunity to hear more of the perspective of what is needed to coordinate better, how communities want to be a part of the planning, and I think, and of response, right? So that how there can be a better response when communities are better trained and prepared. So those are some of the things that we talked about today, and I think, in many ways, we're setting the stage for changes to come.
Hi, Anya Kadadeglia, Canadian Press. You mentioned that the goal is going to be to limit the impact of the upcoming wildfire season on Canadians. How specifically are you going to do that? What's the plan?
So some of the things is also learning from the last year's wildfire season. Simple things like it's what we call a Fire Smart program is supporting high-risk areas in their support for Fire Smart. And what Fire Smart really is, it's not about clear-cutting and having a gap in between fires. It's about looking at the right soil, what type of plants need to be planted, the trimming and removing of fuel. And the reason I say this is when I flew over West Kelowna that was heavily impacted last year, areas where they actually had the Fire Smart program, houses were protected. Where it wasn't, the fire went right through. But one thing that I actually learned last year was that the Fire Smart program also protects the soil. Where it didn't, actually burnt the soil almost 4 feet down. So that soil is destroyed in some cases for about 100 years. So that's what the Fire Smart program is about. So even though there might be an actual fire that takes place, it'll have less of an impact. We also talked about response. How do you early detect what's being called some of the zombie fires that have been burning throughout the winter, and some have already been reactivated. How to early detect those and tackle those very quickly before they become interface fires that can impact a small town. So these are just some of the examples that we're looking at for response. As we look at the response piece, every single year we need to make sure that we're focusing on prevention. So whether it's Fire Smart, whether it's the education for Canadians in terms of how to become Fire Smart. And another thing that I learned during this time that was consistent across the board was where the outside patio furniture is placed. And it sounds ridiculous, right? But every single firefighter that I spoke with, when it comes to what they would do when they go into an area, was actually moving patio furniture out of the way, because most of the patio furniture, when it lights up, it burns longer and it burns brighter, and then the house has a potential to catch on fire. So those are some of the things that we need to do. So it's a whole kind of a package from the response, prevention, and also education as well.
So more broadly then, what can Canadians expect to be different this time in terms of government response, both federal and provincial, territorial? Like, is there a different strategy this time around than there was last year?
So I wouldn't say that there's a different strategy. It's about coordinating to be more responsive. I would say that because we had significant wildfires, we were able to move the resources around, have international firefighters also come in. We're also looking at each provinces are looking at their own capabilities of training more firefighters, just as we as a federal government have offered up training of 1,000 firefighters. There's a communication piece. And one other aspect is you can train as many firefighters that you want, but you also need the experienced leaders within those. So that's one of the reasons why we also started a program which was actually started last year, to train the leaders within that. I forget exactly what they're called within that system, but they're the one that actually can take the ones who are trained up to a level 1 and level 2 firefighting and take them into areas and do the difficult work. So those are some of the changes that have already been made. Communication is another one, making sure that we have the right communication gear in the right places. Where, for example, in the territories, we were sent a lot of Starlink systems. Now we're anticipating where they might be, and they're already being sent. For example, I believe some of the systems are still in the territories themselves. And finally, the day that we had with the Indigenous leaders, we need to get better and better, and I think we have, of using their local knowledge as well. And in British Columbia, I would say we've done that far better than in previous years, and I have to give kudos to the provincial government who have been leading the way on this, where the Tecumseh First Nations have been working on an evacuation center that was, by the time that it was open, was already being utilized. Also building Indigenous response capability as well. For example, in the Yukon, I believe 13 First Nations communities have gotten together and started a company to train Indigenous youth on firefighting. So a lot of work is taking place. So what we're trying to do is overall within the different years, look at all the tools that we have so that all the provinces and territories knows exactly what exists. So when something happens, we're able to respond very quickly. And that's what the last 2 days we focused on.
Thank you. We have one question on the phone. We will now go online. Operator, if you want to connect, please. It's one question, one follow-up. Please state your name and your media outlet. On va maintenant passer aux questions au téléphone. Nous allons passer à ceux qui sont en ligne virtuellement. L'opérateur va pouvoir les connecter. C'est une question, un follow-up. Et s'il vous plaît, veuillez mentionner votre nom et votre média. Merci.
First question is from, la première question vient de Eric Bowling of Inuvik Drum Northern News Services. À vous la parole. Please go ahead.
Thank you for taking my question. I'm just wondering, here in the NWT, we've got a real infrastructure deficit. And during the evacuation last year, Yellowknifers had basically one road to take out. Here at Inuvik, we're in a similar boat. Our lifeline is the Dempster Highway. So I'm wondering if there's any discussion about like expanding on infrastructure available to remote communities, because there's a number of communities here in the north are fly-in, fly-out only. I'm pretty sure there's also a number of communities in northern Manitoba that are fly-in, fly-out. So I'm just wondering what talks have been put in place about that.
No, it's a very good question. And when I've been to those areas, in fact, actually, I was there right after the disasters, but I spent a lot of time in the north and the high north and to look at the various infrastructure. As we're talking about emergency preparedness, there's a far wider, from us as our other federal departments are also looking at this as well from a holistic approach, as well as the provinces and territories are also looking at how we can work together on some of these challenges. So it's not just about the transportation. We're looking at the air hubs as well. What type of air hubs are going to be needed. In addition to this, communication lines. As you know, there was one communication line that went in the Northwest Territories, and we're monitoring very closely, and sadly, it was damaged, and all communication was disconnected from into the territories, and why those Starlink systems were needed. So that's why we're anticipating some of those things and making sure that we have the right communication gears in place. So in addition to roads, we're looking at communication lines as well, but also future aspects of what we can do with the various airports. I can tell you is that we have been looking at some of the challenges in the north for some time. When we conducted our defense policy review before the launch of our defense policy, we looked at what if an emergency did take place up in the north, how would the Canadian Armed Forces respond? And that plan was put into place last summer. And in addition to this, when I was Minister of Defense, I actually put funding in to extend the Inuvik runway. So what we're trying to do is that the various government departments looking at every opportunity. When we look at infrastructure, we're trying to also look at it through emergency preparedness lens as well.
I'll speak to that as well. You identified the challenges in Manitoba, and I certainly raised that today, speaking about those infrastructure concerns and deficits in the north. I had the opportunity to speak with the Northwest Territories Minister responsible for highways last week as well, and we had a similar conversation. So we're aware of those deficits. I am the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure, and the issue around flying communities, our northern airports, and winter roads is high on our priority for many, many reasons, but including emergency management. So thank you for raising that, and do know that it is on our radar and a significant piece of work for our provinces, but also with help from the federal government that we need to address.
Is there a follow-up?
Yes. Following with that, my understanding is over the last little while, there's been a number of closures of lookout towers over the last 10 or so years as fire prevention moved to more satellites. That's come under a bit of fire, no pun intended, because in more recent times. I'm wondering if there's any interest or plans to re-establish lookout towers as part of the fire prevention process.
I won't be able to speak to the lookout towers because I don't have that information, but I would not discount some of the technology that's also being looked at and also being put into place, because it can be extremely helpful. I know that some of the technology that we've been discussing with the various companies right now can improve the capabilities of detecting fires and responding to things far better than even eyeballs and binoculars. We have amazing technology right now. Even some of the new aircraft that was put into place for search and rescue in the Canadian Armed Forces will have a significant, let's put it this way, system that the military would use, but it would be used for search and rescue in terms of radar systems, thermal, and even communication gears as well, where an aircraft can become a cell tower. And there's a satellite technology. Some companies, I won't talk about which companies right now, but also looking at supplementing some of their own towers with emergency systems. So we are looking at all across the board, not just what we're doing at the federal and provincial and territorial governments. We're also looking at how we can work with industry as well. As satellite technology improves, it gives us greater predictability on where and how we should respond. NRCan will be launching additional satellites in this regard. Plus, there'll be more information also coming out on how we're going to be utilizing this. What this will allow us to do is look at focusing on the prevention side. Where are those hotspots, and where do we need to tackle them early on before they actually become a fire? Eventually, drone systems are being used in Alberta. I know that in Alberta, they have used this extremely well, and we want to take a look, use those lessons, and how we can apply this to the other provinces. So, like I said, I can't talk about the lookout towers, but I want to give absolute confidence to Canadians that the technology that's being put into place is one that will be extremely useful, not only for the prevention, but also for the response.
Thank you so much. This now concludes our press conference. Merci beaucoup. Ceci conclut la conférence de presse. Merci de vous être présenté. Au revoir.